Good day, everyone. Welcome to the conference Advancing Ethics, Human Rights, and Social Justice in Social Service Delivery in South Africa. My name is Neleh Ince, and today I have chosen to speak on the social service delivery issue of the lack of support systems for victims of gender-based violence in South Africa. Before we begin, this is just an outline of the content that will be covered in today's presentation. We have the introduction, the definition of ethics, human rights, and social justice, the lack of support services for victims of gender-based violence, the causes of the problem, the effect of the problem on victims of gender-based violence, what I as a social worker can do to address this problem, and lastly, the conclusion. As I mentioned in the beginning, the topic I will be covering today is the lack of support services for victims of gender-based violence in South Africa. In order to understand the full severity of this problem, it is important to know the basics as to why this matter is classified as an ethical, human rights, and social justice issue by defining these three concepts. Ethics can be defined as a code of morals or a moral philosophy that governs an individual's behaviors and actions. Everybody's code of ethics is different due to their cultural, socioeconomic, and religious background. However, social workers have a code of ethics set by the National Association of Social Workers that must be adhered to in order to remain as professional as possible when working in the social work field. Human rights, according to the United Nations, are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Examples of human rights include the right to life, the right to quality education, and the right to safety and security. With these rights come responsibilities. For instance, due to the right to have access to medical care, no one is allowed to deny or hinder another person's medical needs, as this would be violating their human rights. Social justice is the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. Due to the world we live in, not everybody has access to equal rights and opportunities. Thus, as social workers, we aim to help provide those in need with the resources required to live full and prosperous lives. As one can see from the mentioned definitions, the lack of support services for victims of gender-based violence can be seen as an ethical, human rights, and social justice issue because the victims of this violence are not being given the resources they are entitled to receive in order to heal from their trauma and become functioning members of society. The lack of support services for victims of gender-based violence. South Africa is dubbed the rape capital of the world by Human Rights Watch, and the female homicide rate is nearly 6 times the global average. Thus, it is unsurprising that the country experiences high levels of gender-based violence. Although gender-based violence is an issue of itself, the lack of support systems within South Africa is also cause for concern, seeing as the prevalence of GBV decreases with higher wealth divisions and education. And most victims do not have the financial means or knowledge to cope with the after effects of gender-based violence. Thus, victims need to rely on the support of women and children's shelters. There is a shortage in the number of victim shelters available in South Africa compared to the number of victims in need of support. The demand is much higher than the current shelters can support, leading women and children to being turned away, or funds being redirected in order to try combat the number of victims in the shelter. Women and children residing in rural areas are more vulnerable to gender-based violence, which leads to the issue of there being a lack of access to shelters for victims in said areas. Since there are no shelters nearby, this would mean victims would need to travel in order to get to a shelter and acquire help. However, for most women and children in rural areas, this is not feasible due to the cost of transport and the fear of leaving their home. The state of victim shelters itself is another pressing matter, as shelters are not conducive to assisting victims at 100% capacity due to the lack of funding. Also, because most victims coming to the shelter have little to more education, this creates a dependency on a shelter that cannot provide everything the victim needs. Why is this issue occurring? In order to address any issue, one needs to understand the cause of said issue and the main reason for the lack of support services for victims of gender-based violence is underfunding from the government. Most women and children's shelters rely on government funds to operate, but the funds provided are not sufficient enough to deal with operating expenses and needed resources. In addition, it doesn't help that the budget for these shelters is being reduced every financial year. For instance, the budget for the 2023-2024 financial year saw an increase of only 3.5%, which is far below the current CPI inflation rate of 5.1%. The increase in budget is of little value since the same issues are being faced considering the economic state of the country. Not only does the lack of support services for victims of gender-based violence reflect poorly on South Africa as a whole, but the victims, those who require help, suffer the most. As mentioned earlier, the shortage of shelters creates a demand that cannot be catered to in a feasible manner. Due to underfunding, if a shelter takes in more victims than it can handle, other victims' allocations lessens to accommodate the new arrival. This is unfair to both parties who deserve access to their equal share of needed resources. In one instance, the Eldorado Park Women's Forum Shelter in Johannesburg has 24 beds for survivors of gender-based violence and human trafficking, but it receives funds from the government for only 12 beneficiaries. This means that let's say each victim is meant to receive 7,000 Rand worth of resources, that the number gets instantly halved because the money needs to be dispersed among all victims even if the government did not consider them. Another consequence, which again is due to lack of sufficient funds, can be seen in the need to support survivors in finding employment in order to sustain themselves post the shelter. The skills development and training offered differs on each shelter's ability to provide such resources. Some women reported that they received no training, while others report that they acquired lessons in computer skills. Seeing as most of the victims coming to the shelters have little to no education, it is important to provide them with the necessary skill set to live independently. But if funding is limited, victims cannot receive this help and are left defenseless when they leave the shelter, which could land them back in dangerous situations. What I, as a social worker, can do in order to help solve the problem. As a social worker, it is my job to ensure that those in need have access to the best available resources needed to improve their quality of life, and in this instance, I am working with the shelters themselves. The first thing I would try to do is secure more funding, not from the government, but rather from the private sector. By partnering with an entity from the private sector, I can ensure consistent funding for a set number of shelters, as a contract that is legally binding will need to be signed in order to obtain the money, whereas with the government there is no contract to hold them accountable to. My main aim is to partner or secure funding from a major bank, where the money will be used for transportation, education, and skills development and training. By trying to target the issue of funding, I can collectively solve most of the problems experienced by gender-based violence shelters, as the root of these problems is due to a lack of funds. This approach has been done before. World Bank committed $100 million to prevent gender-based violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo and aimed to reach 795,000 beneficiaries. The project provided help to survivors of gender-based violence and aimed to shift social norms by promoting gender equality and behavioral change through strong partnerships with civil society organizations. Although the reasons for the funds are different, I believe it is possible to secure, and in order to ensure there is no mismanagement of money, it would be in everybody's best interest for an accountant to oversee where and how the money will be spent. With these funds, shelters can remain open and provide victims of gender-based violence with the needed resources to overcome their trauma, such as counseling or medical treatment, and become functioning members of society through skills development and education programs. To end off, this is an issue of great importance and needs to be addressed as soon as possible. So to you, members of this conference, I implore you to help me in trying to secure funding for women and children shelters in order to ensure that victims of gender-based violence suffer no more. Thank you.